The Arizona sun beat down mercilessly on the cracked earth, turning the desert into a furnace that seemed to breathe fire with every gust of wind. Jake Sullivan pulled his worn hat lower over his weathered face, squinting against the glare that danced off the endless expanse of sand and rock. His horse, a faithful bay mare named Dusty, plodded forward with the weary determination of an animal that had seen too many miles and too little water. 3 days. That's how long it would take to reach Tombstone, where Jake hoped to find work at one of the silver mines. 3 days with nothing but a single piece of hardtack bread wrapped in oiled cloth, tucked deep in his saddlebags alongside his father's old Colt revolver and a near-empty canteen that sloshed with barely enough water to wet his cracked lips. The landscape stretched endlessly before him, a tapestry of muted browns and burnt oranges, broken only by the occasional saguaro cactus standing like a sentinel against the bleached sky. Jake had ridden this route before, back when he still had cattle to drive and a future that seemed certain. Now at 35, he was just another drifter chasing rumors of work and trying to outrun the memories of a ranch that no longer existed and a woman who had chosen another man's stability over his wandering heart. The silence was absolute, except for the rhythmic creak of leather and the soft thud of Dusty's hooves against the hardpan. Jake had learned to appreciate this solitude over the years. It was honest, at least. Out here, a man faced only the truth of his circumstances, stripped of the polite lies that civilization wrapped around its harsh realities. As the afternoon wore on, the heat became a living thing, pressing down on Jake's shoulders like a heavy blanket. His shirt, once blue, had faded to the color of old denim and clung to his back with sweat. He allowed himself a small sip from his canteen, feeling the precious liquid coat his throat before disappearing into the desert's endless thirst. It was then that he saw her. At first, Jake thought it was a mirage, a trick of the heat in his tired eyes. But as Dusty drew closer to what appeared to be a dried riverbed, the figure became unmistakably real. A young Native American girl, no more than 12 years old, lay crumpled beside a cluster of barrel cacti. Her dark hair spread like a fan across the sun-bleached sand. Jake's heart clenched. He'd seen death before too many times, but something about the small, still form struck him with unexpected force. He dismounted quickly, his boots hitting the ground with a soft thud that seemed unnaturally loud in the oppressive silence. "Easy there, girl," he murmured, approaching slowly with his hands visible. Experience had taught him that wounded creatures, human or otherwise, could be dangerous in their fear. As he knelt beside her, Jake could see the rise and fall of her chest, shallow but steady. She was alive, barely. Her lips were cracked and bleeding, her skin flushed with the telltale signs of heat exhaustion. Her simple deerskin dress was torn in places, and her small moccasins were worn thin from what must have been days of walking. "Can you hear me?" Jake asked softly, gently touching her shoulder. The girl's eyes fluttered open, dark eyes that held a depth of intelligence and pain that made Jake's breath catch. She looked at him with a mixture of fear and desperate hope, her lips moving soundlessly. Without hesitation, Jake reached for his canteen, supporting the girl's head with one hand while bringing the water to her lips with the other. She drank greedily, too quickly, and Jake had to pull the canteen away to prevent her from making herself sick. "Slow now," he said, his voice gentle but firm. "Just a little at a time." The girl's eyes never left his face, and Jake found himself wondering what she saw there. He'd never thought of himself as particularly kind. Kindness was a luxury he'd rarely been able to afford, but something in those dark eyes called to a part of him that he'd thought long dead. When she'd had enough water, Jake sat back on his heels, considering his options. The girl was clearly lost, probably separated from her people. In this heat, without water, she wouldn't last another day, but Jake's own supplies were already stretched thin, and taking on a passenger would mean... He stopped the thought before it could fully form. There was no decision to make, really. He'd known that the moment he saw her lying there in the sand. Reaching into his saddlebags, Jake pulled out the carefully wrapped piece of hardtack bread. It was his last food, meant to sustain him through the long journey ahead. He unwrapped it slowly, breaking off a small piece and offering it to the girl. She stared at the bread as if it were made of gold, then looked up at Jake with an expression that cut straight through to his soul. Tears began to flow down her dusty cheeks as she took the piece with trembling hands, eating it slowly, savoring every crumb. Jake broke off another piece, then another, until the entire portion was gone. The girl ate with the desperate gratitude of someone who had been close to death, and Jake felt something shift inside his chest, a warmth that had nothing to do with the desert heat. "What's your name?" he asked, though he wasn't sure she would understand English. "Ayana," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Ayana, it means eternal blossom." Jake smiled, the first genuine smile he'd worn in months. "Well, Ayana, I'm Jake, and we're going to get you back to your people." As the sun began its descent toward the horizon, painting the desert in shades of gold and crimson, Jake helped Ayana to her feet. She was weak but determined, and together they walked toward Dusty, who stood patiently in the gathering dusk. Jake had no way of knowing that he'd just given his last meal to the daughter of Chief Standing Bear, or that 200 Lakota warriors were already searching for her. All he knew was that he'd done what felt right, and for the first time in years that was enough. The desert wind picked up as they prepared to make camp, carrying with it the scent of sage and the promise of a cooler night. But it also carried something else, the distant sound of horses, growing closer with each passing moment. The pre-dawn darkness pressed against Jake's eyelids like a cold hand, pulling him from the shallow sleep that had claimed him sometime after midnight. Years of living on the frontier had taught him to wake at the slightest disturbance, and now every instinct screamed that something was wrong. Ayana lay curled beside the dying embers of their small fire, wrapped in Jake's spare blanket, her breathing deep and peaceful for the first time since he'd found her. The girl had barely spoken during the evening, but she'd managed to eat some of the rabbits Jake had snared, and color had returned to her cheeks. She'd watched him with those intelligent dark eyes as he'd tended to Dusty and prepared their modest camp, and Jake had found himself talking to her in the gentle way he might have spoken to a daughter he'd never had. Now, in the gray hour before sunrise, Jake sat perfectly still, listening to the desert's subtle symphony. The wind whispered through the sagebrush, and somewhere in the distance, a coyote called to its pack. But beneath these familiar sounds, Jake detected something else, a rhythmic thundering that made his blood run cold. Hoofbeats, many of them. Jake's hand moved instinctively to his Colt, though he left it holstered. Whatever was coming, it was too large to fight. He'd spent enough years in Apache country to recognize the sound of a war party moving at speed, and this sounded like an army. "Ayana," he whispered urgently, gently shaking the girl's shoulder. "Ayana, wake up." Her eyes opened immediately, alert and focused despite having been deep in sleep moments before. She listened to the approaching sound, and Jake saw recognition dawn in her expression, followed by something that looked almost like relief. "My people," she whispered, sitting up quickly. "They come." Jake's mouth went dry. He'd hoped to get the girl close enough to her tribe to hand her over safely. But this felt different. This felt like judgment riding toward them on 100 horses. The sound grew louder, and Jake could now make out individual hoofbeats, the jingle of gear, the soft calls of riders communicating in the darkness. He stood slowly, his hands visible and empty, as the first riders crested the small rise to the east. They appeared like shadows given form, silhouetted against the lightening sky. Jake's breath caught in his throat as more and more riders appeared. Warriors in war paint, their faces hard as stone, lances and rifles gleaming in the dim light. They moved with the fluid precision of men who had ridden together for years, spreading out to surround Jake's small camp with the efficiency of a closing fist. At their head rode a man who could only be a chief. He was tall and proud, his long hair braided with feathers and beads, his face marked by the kind of scars that spoke of battles fought and survived. His eyes, Jake realized with a start, were the same dark, intelligent eyes that had watched him so intently the night before. Chief Standing Bear. The warriors came to a halt in perfect unison, their horses snorting and stamping in the cool morning air. Jake counted quickly. There had to be at least 200 of them, maybe more. Every man was armed, every face was painted for war, and every eye was fixed on the white cowboy who stood beside their chief's daughter. "Papa!" Ayana cried out, stumbling to her feet and running toward the chief. Standing Bear dismounted in one fluid motion, catching his daughter in his arms and holding her close. For a moment, the hardness left his face, replaced by the pure relief of a father who had found his lost child. Jake stood perfectly still, hardly daring to breathe. He'd heard stories of what happened to white men found with Native American women, especially chiefs' daughters. The fact that he'd helped her might not matter if Standing Bear believed his intentions had been dishonorable. Father and daughter spoke rapidly in their own language, Ayana gesturing toward Jake repeatedly. Standing Bear's eyes never left Jake's face, and Jake tried to read the expression there. Was it gratitude, or was it the cold assessment of a man deciding how his enemy should die? Finally, Standing Bear set his daughter down gently and walked toward Jake. The warriors tensed, hands moving to weapons, but their chief raised a hand for patience. He stopped just out of arm's reach, studying Jake with the intensity of a hawk examining its prey. "You are the one called Jake," Standing Bear said, his English heavily accented but perfectly clear. "My daughter tells me you gave her your last food, your last water." Jake nodded, not trusting his voice. The chief's tone was neutral, giving nothing away. "She tells me you asked for nothing in return, expected nothing. You helped her because it was right." "Any man would have done the same," Jake managed to say, though his voice came out as a rough whisper. Standing Bear's eyes flashed with something that might have been amusement. "Any man?" He gestured broadly at the desert around them. "My daughter walked for 3 days. She passed 2 white settlements. She collapsed twice beside well-traveled roads. How many men helped her before you?" Jake had no answer for that. He'd seen enough of frontier life to know that most people looked out for themselves first, last, and always. Indians and whites lived in an uneasy truce at best, and a lost native child would be seen as someone else's problem by most travelers. "My daughter also tells me something else," Standing Bear continued, his voice dropping to a whisper that somehow carried clearly in the still air. "She says you gave her your blanket when the night grew cold. You built the fire close to her, far from yourself. You spoke to her with kindness, treated her not as a burden but as a guest." The chief paused, looking up at the sky where the first rays of sunlight were painting the clouds in shades of pink and gold. When he looked back at Jake, his expression had changed completely. "In my culture, there is a debt that cannot be repaid with horses or gold or even blood. It is the debt of a father to the man who saves his child's life. You did not just feed my daughter, white man. You gave her your future, your hope of reaching the next town alive. You risked your own life for hers." Standing Bear stepped closer, and Jake could see the moisture in the chief's eyes. "What you have done, I will never forget. What you have done, my people will never forget. What you have done has changed everything." The chief turned to his warriors and spoke in rapid, commanding tones. To Jake's amazement, every man dismounted and began removing their weapons, laying them carefully on the ground. Then, one by one, they approached Jake and touched his shoulder, a gesture he somehow understood was one of respect and acceptance. As the sun finally broke free of the horizon, flooding the desert with golden light, Jake realized that his simple act of human kindness had just altered the course of his entire life. The question was how? The morning sun climbed higher, transforming the desert from a place of shadows into a canvas of gold and amber. Jake stood in the center of what had become an impromptu camp, surrounded by 200 Lakota warriors who had just laid down their weapons in his honor. The enormity of the situation was beginning to sink in, and with it came a mixture of awe and terror that made his hands shake. Chief Standing Bear called for his medicine man, an ancient figure whose face was a map of deep lines and whose eyes held the wisdom of countless seasons. The old man examined Ayana carefully, nodding with satisfaction as he pronounced her healthy and strong. Only then did Standing Bear turn his full attention back to Jake. "You saved my daughter's life," the chief said, his voice carrying across the assembled warriors. "But you did more than that. You showed her that not all white men are enemies. You showed her that kindness still exists in a world that has forgotten how to be kind." Jake shifted uncomfortably. He'd never been good with praise, and the intensity of Standing Bear's gratitude made him feel like he was wearing clothes that didn't fit. "I just did what anyone should do," he said. "She was a child in trouble." "No," Standing Bear said firmly. "What you did was choose to see her as a human being, not as an enemy. That choice has consequences, Jake Sullivan. Good consequences, but consequences nonetheless." The chief gestured to his warriors, who had formed a large circle around them. "These men have ridden for 4 days without rest, searching for my daughter. They were prepared to tear apart every settlement, every ranch, every town until they found her. If she had died... Standing Bear's voice trailed off, but the implication was clear. Jake felt his blood run cold. He'd heard stories of Indian raids, of the terrible swift vengeance that could fall on white settlements when blood was spilled. The image of tombstone burning, of innocent families paying the price for his failure to help, made his stomach turn. But she did not die, Standing Bear continued. She lives because a white cowboy chose mercy over caution, generosity over self-preservation. And so instead of war, we have peace. Instead of vengeance, we have gratitude. One of the younger warriors stepped forward, speaking rapidly in Lakota. Jake caught the emotion in his voice: anger, confusion, distrust. Standing Bear listened patiently, then responded in a calm, measured tone. The conversation continued for several minutes, with other warriors occasionally joining in. Jake didn't need to understand the words to recognize the nature of the debate. Some of my men question this, Standing Bear explained to Jake. They say that one good white man does not erase the wrongs of thousands. They say that kindness can be a trick, a trap to lower our guard. Jake nodded slowly. He understood their skepticism. He'd felt the same way about Indians for most of his life. Trust was a luxury that few on the frontier could afford, and it was usually paid for in blood. "What do you say to them?" Jake asked. Standing Bear smiled, and for a moment, Jake saw not the fearsome war chief but the relieved father who had held his daughter close. "I say that wisdom knows the difference between an enemy and a friend. I say that the man who gives his last bread to a starving child is not an enemy, no matter the color of his skin." The chief walked over to one of his warriors and returned with a magnificent war lance, its shaft decorated with feathers and beadwork that must have taken months to complete. He presented it to Jake with both hands, speaking in formal ceremonial tones. "This belonged to my father, and his father before him. It has never known defeat in battle. I give it to you not as a weapon, but as a symbol. You are now adopted into our tribe, Jake Sullivan. You are my brother, and Ayanna is your sister. Our people are your people." Jake accepted the lance with trembling hands, feeling the weight of history in its perfectly balanced shaft. "I don't know what to say," he managed. "Say that you will remember this moment," Standing Bear replied. "Say that you will remember that enemies can become brothers, that hatred can become love, that a single act of kindness can change the world." As if summoned by the chief's words, Ayanna appeared at Jake's side. She had been cleaned and dressed in fresh clothing, and she looked every inch the proud daughter of a chief. But when she smiled at Jake, she was still the frightened, grateful child he had found dying in the desert. "I want to give you something too," she said in her soft accented English. She pulled a small pouch from her dress and placed it in Jake's hands. "These are seeds from the eternal blossom flower. My grandmother gave them to me before she died. She said they would only grow for someone with a pure heart." Jake looked down at the tiny seeds in his palm, feeling their surprising weight. "I can't take these, Ayanna. They're too important." "That is why you must take them," she said seriously. "Plant them when you reach your destination. If they grow, you will know that what you did was right. If they grow, you will always have a piece of my people with you." Standing Bear placed a hand on Jake's shoulder. "There is one more thing," he said. "You spoke of traveling to Tombstone to find work. This is no longer necessary. You have a place with us now if you choose to take it. You would be welcome in our village, treated as family." Jake looked around at the sea of faces surrounding him, warriors who had been prepared for battle, but now looked at him with something approaching respect. It was tempting, this offer of belonging. He had been alone for so long, drifting from town to town with no real purpose beyond survival. But even as he considered it, Jake knew what his answer had to be. "I'm honored," he said carefully. "More honored than I can say. But I think I can do more good out there." He gestured toward the wider world, "than I can hiding in safety. People need to know that Indians and whites can be friends. They need to see that we're not so different after all." Standing Bear nodded approvingly. "Spoken like a true warrior. You choose the harder path, the path of the bridge builder. It is a good choice." As the warriors began to prepare for departure, Jake found himself thinking about the journey ahead. He still had no food, no money, and no clear prospects. But he had something else now, a purpose that was larger than his own survival. He carried with him the proof that understanding was possible. that the cycle of violence and mistrust that had defined the frontier for so long could be broken. The sun was high overhead when Standing Bear's band finally rode away, disappearing into the shimmering heat haze like a vision from another world. Jake stood alone with Dusty, watching them go. The war lance still in his hands and Ayana's seed safe in his pocket. He had given away his last bread to a starving child, expecting nothing in return. Instead, he had received something infinitely more valuable, a reminder that kindness was not weakness, that compassion was not foolishness, and that sometimes the smallest gestures could have the largest consequences. As he climbed back into his saddle and pointed Dusty toward Tombstone, Jake Sullivan knew that his life had been forever changed. The question now was what he would do with that change. 6 months later, Jake stood in the dusty main street of Tombstone, watching as a stagecoach rolled to a stop in front of the Wells Fargo office. The town was buzzing with its usual chaotic energy, miners heading to their shifts, gamblers emerging from all-night poker games, and merchants hawking their wares to anyone with silver to spend. But Jake had learned to see past the surface chaos to the underlying tensions that simmered just below. The silver mines had brought prosperity to Tombstone, but they had also brought conflict. White miners clashed with Mexican workers over wages and working conditions. Apache raids still threatened the outskirts of town, and the old prejudices died hard. Jake had seen firsthand how quickly suspicion could turn to violence when fear was involved. He'd found work easily enough, just as he'd hoped. His reputation as a skilled cowboy and his surprising knowledge of Indian customs had made him valuable to several ranchers in the area. But Jake had discovered that his true calling lay elsewhere. He had become something he'd never expected to be, a peacemaker, a bridge between two worlds that had been at war for generations. The war lance that Standing Bear had given him hung prominently in his small room above the saloon, and Jake had made no secret of how he'd earned it. The story of his encounter with Chief Standing Bear had spread throughout the territory, growing in the telling until it had become legend. Some dismissed it as tall tale, but others, those who knew Jake's reputation for honesty, began to look at him with new respect. More importantly, Jake had used his newfound status to broker peace between local ranchers and the Apache bands that moved through the area. When rustlers struck, he helped organize posses that focused on recovery rather than revenge. When misunderstandings arose, he served as translator and mediator. Slowly, carefully, he was building something that had never existed before: trust. The stagecoach door opened, and Jake watched as a familiar figure stepped down onto the wooden sidewalk. It was Marshal Williams, the federal lawman who had been sent to investigate the ongoing conflicts in the territory. He was a good man, but like many officials from back east, he had little understanding of the complexities of frontier life. "Jake," Williams called out, spotting him across the street. "Just the man I wanted to see. We need to talk." Jake crossed over, touching the brim of his hat in greeting. "Marshal, what brings you back to Tombstone?" Williams looked around nervously, as if afraid of being overheard. "There's been a development. Big one. The government is planning to move the remaining Apache bands to a reservation in Florida. They want to clear the territory completely." Jake felt his heart sink. He'd heard rumors of such plans, but he'd hoped they were just political posturing. "When?" "Within the month. I've been ordered to coordinate with the army to ensure there's no resistance." Williams paused, studying Jake's face. "I know you've built relationships with these people. I'm hoping you can help make the transition peaceful." Jake was quiet for a long moment, thinking of Standing Bear and his warriors, of Ayana and her gentle smile. The idea of them being herded onto a reservation hundreds of miles from their homeland made his stomach turn. But he also understood the realities of power and politics. The Apache had been fighting a losing battle for decades, and their resistance was only providing excuses for harsher measures. "I'll talk to them," Jake said finally, "but I can't promise they'll listen. You're asking them to give up everything they've ever known." "I know," Williams said quietly. "But the alternative is war, Jake. Real war with federal troops and artillery. A lot of good people will die on both sides." That evening, Jake rode out to the pre-arranged meeting place, a hidden canyon where he'd met with Apache leaders several times before. As he'd expected, Standing Bear was waiting for him along with several other chiefs and a handful of warriors. The months had been hard on them. Jake could see the strain in their faces, the weariness of people who had been fighting for too long. "My brother," Standing Bear said, embracing Jake warmly. "It is good to see you. Ayana sends her greetings. She has learned to read the white man's writing and asks me to tell you that the seeds you planted have grown into beautiful flowers." Jake smiled, despite the gravity of the situation. He had indeed planted Ayana's seeds in a small garden behind his boarding house, tending them carefully through the dry summer months. When they had finally bloomed, brilliant purple flowers that seemed to glow in the desert light, Jake had felt a deep sense of connection to the girl who had given them to him. "I have difficult news," Jake said without preamble. Standing Bear and the other chiefs listened without interruption as Jake explained the government's plans. He watched their faces carefully, seeing anger and despair war with resignation. "So it comes to this," Standing Bear said finally. "We must choose between exile and extinction." "There might be another way," Jake said slowly. He'd been thinking about this possibility during his ride, and the more he considered it, the more sense it made. "What if I could arrange for you to meet with the territorial governor, face to face, as equals? If he could see that you're not the savage warriors the newspapers make you out to be, maybe he could be convinced to set aside land here in Arizona." One of the younger chiefs laughed bitterly. "You ask us to trust the word of white politicians. How many treaties have they broken? How many promises have they made and abandoned?" "This would be different," Jake insisted. "I would stake my reputation on it, my life, if necessary." Standing Bear studied Jake for a long moment. "You would do this? Risk everything for people who are not your blood?" "You became my blood when you made me your brother," Jake replied. "Besides, this isn't just about you. It's about proving that we can live together, that we don't have to destroy each other to survive." The negotiations that followed were the most difficult of Jake's life. It took weeks of careful diplomacy, calling in every favor and leveraging every relationship he'd built over the months. The territorial governor was skeptical, the army was resistant, and many of the local ranchers were openly hostile to the idea of a permanent Apache presence. But Jake persisted, using the story of his rescue of Ayana as a powerful symbol of what was possible when people chose understanding over fear. He organized a carefully choreographed meeting between Standing Bear and the governor, ensuring that the Apache chief was presented not as a defeated enemy, but as a leader seeking peaceful coexistence. The breakthrough came when Ayana herself arrived in Tombstone, now a poised young woman of 16 who spoke perfect English and carried herself with quiet dignity. She had learned to read and write from a sympathetic missionary, and her intelligence and grace charmed even the most hardened skeptics. "My people do not ask for charity," she told the gathered officials. "We ask only for the chance to live in peace on the land our ancestors have called home for generations. In return, we offer our friendship, our knowledge of the desert, and our promise to protect the settlers who have chosen to make this place their home as well." The final agreement was far from perfect, but it was a beginning. The Apache would be granted a reservation in the mountainous region north of Tombstone, where they could maintain their traditional way of life, while also serving as scouts and guides for the territorial government. In exchange, they would help maintain peace in the region and assist with the capture of bandits and renegades. On the day the treaty was signed, Jake stood with Standing Bear and Ayana outside the government building, watching as curious crowds gathered to witness this historic moment. There were still those who grumbled about coddling savages, but there were also many who saw the wisdom in choosing peace over war. "You did it," Ayana said, taking Jake's hand. "You brought our peoples together." Jake shook his head. "I just gave away my last piece of bread to a hungry child. Everything else followed from that." Standing Bear smiled. "That is the lesson, my brother. We cannot control the consequences of our actions, but we can choose to act with kindness. The rest is in the hands of the Great Spirit." As the sun set over Tombstone, painting the desert in shades of gold and crimson, Jake reflected on the journey that had brought him to this moment. He had started as a drifter with no purpose beyond survival, but he had discovered that even the smallest acts of compassion could change the world. The eternal blossoms in his garden were blooming again, their purple petals a reminder that beauty could flourish even in the harshest environments. And somewhere in the distance, he could hear the sound of children playing, Apache and white children together, learning that the color of a person's skin mattered far less than the content of their character. Jake Sullivan had given away his last bread expecting nothing in return. Instead, he had received something infinitely more valuable, The knowledge that kindness was never wasted, that understanding was always possible, and that sometimes the greatest victories were won not with weapons, but with simple human compassion. In the gathering darkness, as the first stars appeared in the desert sky, Jake knew that his story was far from over. There would be more challenges ahead, more opportunities to choose between fear and hope, between hatred and love. But he also knew that he would never again face those choices alone. He had found his family, his purpose, and his place in the world, and it had all begun with a single act of kindness to a starving child in the desert.